let's start with something nice and light. Nuclear proliferation. Mm-hmm. So Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they just visited Tokyo in July, and they talked about, with their counterparts, extended deterrence. So what does that mean?
What it means, actually, when it comes to Japan is nuclear weapons. The Japanese want to make sure that the Americans have nuclear weapons that they are willing to fire at anybody that threatens Japan. And that's a little bit paradoxical because the Japanese supposedly are the world's most anti-nuclear weapons people there are. So it's one of those paradoxes of Japan. It's not too hard to understand if you get human nature.
I was going to say, they obviously have a very unique relationship with nuclear weapons. And while I could understand the military and defense side of things, kind of understanding that, maybe having U.S. nukes around might deter China, how do people in Japan feel about that? Grave of the Fireflies and all that.
Well, Japanese people, like most people, like to avoid thinking about unpleasantness. There's just an assumption that things will kind of work out and that somehow the Americans will take care of things if the Japanese themselves can't do it. And since the Japanese themselves can't do it, there has just been this assumption that's grown up over 60, 70 years that if there's any gaps in Japan's defense, that the Americans will take care of it. But nobody likes to talk about nuclear weapons. And if you if you ask Japanese people, should Japan have nuclear weapons, most of them would say, well, no, of course not. But when you see what Japanese leaders and officials get together and talk to the Americans, they're saying, you got them, don't you? And you use them. And even the former Prime Minister Abe, before he was shot, he was pretty clear that he wouldn't mind if the Americans even had nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. And he sort of hinted that he wouldn't mind if the Americans let them borrow them now and then. A little bit funny, but not too much.
Well, and so the idea of extended deterrence is that the U.S. would promise to use nukes to defend Japan, put nukes in Japan, store them there?
It's at a minimum. It's to, if necessary, use U.S. nuclear weapons to defend Japan. The question of where you actually put them is another question. And some would say that, look, if you're using nuclear weapons, you can fire them from a long way away. They don't have to be in Japan. But sometimes there's a political reason for having nuclear weapons on your territory. It shows that you're serious about using them. And I think that is part of the issue, that the Japanese just aren't just aren't convinced that the Americans are going to really use them if the time comes. The Americans have tried to reassure them repeatedly, but it doesn't quite work for some reason. And it's almost like some guy someone being asked, well, do you love me? And goes, yeah, I swear I do. And really? Yeah, I do. I really. And you keep getting asked this over and over. And that's sort of what the Japanese are doing to the Americans because they're just not quite convinced. There isn't really yet, I don't think, a threat here on the Japanese part that, look, if we're not sure, we're going to build our own. I don't think it's at that point at all. But a few things happen, and it could get there. But it does show just how worried the Japanese are about the Chinese threat. They wouldn't really have had this discussion 20 years ago.
Do you think they keep asking because they're worried about the CCP or because there's something the U.S. is doing or not doing that's not reassuring to them?
The Chinese have just scared the daylights out of the Japanese. They won't come out and say it so clearly, but they're worried. And they have known this for at least a decade. But in a Japanese-y kind of way, you don't sort of start screaming about a problem, whereas we would. But the Japanese don't do it. But they know what the threat is. And when the Chinese say things like, well, we're going to carpet Japan from end to end with nuclear weapons if you do anything to help Taiwan, well, it's not like the Japanese don't hear it. It's not like the Japanese don't take them seriously. So that is part of what is going on here.
I mean, is that a legitimate threat from China that they would completely nuke Japan if they helped in Taiwan? Because I would think that they would be afraid of some kind of response from the U.S. or even Japan like that. That seems like almost just such an extreme, ridiculous threat.
Well, it sounds ridiculous, but when you hear it, if you're Japanese, it does give you some concern, particularly given the history of all of this. And you just don't quite know. And for many Japanese, there's no great love for China, or the Chinese, put it that, Chinese communists at least. And I think the feeling is reciprocated. I remember this was probably 20 years ago. I was invited to dinner by a sort of a lady in China whose father was with the embassy. And I don't remember what they wanted. It was a visa or something. And during the conversation, this Chinese woman who was studying at a Japanese university, had lots of Japanese friends. She was talking about, and in the context of it, she was talking about her Japanese acquaintances, her friends, and she was referring to them in Japanese as, well, the oni. And I hadn't heard the word. But she kept talking about oni, oni this, oni that, as referring to the Japanese, obviously. And I thought it was like a term of endearment. And I went back and checked, and it's actually a word for the red ogre or demon. And she was throwing it out like you might have heard in West Texas in 1950 talking about some racial minorities. And it was just a matter of course. And that told me something about this fundamental attitude towards the Japanese. And, one thing leads to another. And the threat to nuke Japan is not far-fetched. And I think the Japanese are concerned about that.
If anyone's a red demon, it's the dirty Reds, the communists. Just a factual statement I'm putting out there.